The road before you is still a long one, but do not lose heart. At the end of it, you will find unity.
William Teals, Falcon of Light, prepare to lose your life!
Timegate: Knight's Chase is a historical fantasy adventure developed by Infogrames Europe and published in December 1995. Players take the role of William Tibbs, a law student studying in Paris, whose world is turned upside down when he is attacked by a mysterious cult of black magicians. Tibbs and his fiancée Juliette are catapulted back in time to 14th century France, where Tibbs is arrested for witchcraft and sentenced to death. Our hero soon discovers that he has been drawn into an ancient feud between the mortal servants of light and dark, a conflict of gods and demons that stretches back to before the dawn of humanity. To save Juliette and return to the present, Tibbs must seek out the last of the Knights Templar and uncover the secrets of the mysterious Hawk of Light. Timegate was intended as a successor to the seminal Alone in the Dark trilogy, a fresh coat of paint for a series whose star had once burned bright, but by the mid-90s was no longer such a hot property. The original Alone in the Dark was released in 1992 and was a stunning critical and financial success for Infogrames. Regarded as revolutionary in its blend of arcade and adventure gameplay, real-time 3D polygonal graphics, and Lovecraftian terror. The game's influence quickly spread far beyond the French gaming industry, and the developers hoped Infogrames would give them the time and resources to make the game's sequel an equally ambitious endeavour. But Infogrames, who were preparing to go public on the Paris Stock Exchange, had very different plans. Infogrames viewed their new franchise as an instant cash cow that should be milked for all it was worth, and demanded staff immediately get to work on a follow-up title using the original engine, with no room for delays. At the same time, some on the development team felt that Infogrames chairman Bruno Bonnell had cheated them out of both artistic and financial credit for Alone in the Dark, causing a further rift between the developers and Infogrames' upper management. These factors caused several key figures to depart the company and found Adeline Entertainment, most notably the game's director, Frédéric Renal. Infogrames were unfazed by the controversy and quickly reorganized the development team, and thus Alone in the Dark 2 hit shelves just a year after the release of the original game. Despite lacking any gameplay or technological innovations beyond an increased emphasis on combat, the sequel was another commercial hit for Infogrames. Most reviewers received Alone in the Dark 2 very positively, but some did quietly observe that Infogrames' strategy seemed to be churning out annualized entries in the series without making any substantial improvements. And sure enough, yet another Alone in the Dark title dutifully shuffled onto the market in late 1994. Alone in the Dark 3 again used the same engine as the original title, and again made minimal changes to the formula that had carried the series along since 1992. This time, reviewers were somewhat less forgiving of the old warhorse, grumbling of dated visuals, awkward controls, and an obstructive camera. Just 2 years after Alone in the Dark's original debut, Computer Gaming World suggested that it was time for the series to be put to rest. Permanently. The critical response in itself was perhaps not that serious a problem. Most publications still gave Alone in the Dark 3 passable scores, but there were a number of changes happening in the industry around this time that did not bode well for the series' future. First of all, the seeds planted by the original Alone in the Dark were slowly beginning to bear fruit. Titles similar to or even directly inspired by the first game were approaching release, such as Andrew Spencer's Ecstatica, Argonaut's Alien Odyssey, Adeline's own Little Big Adventure, Origin Systems' BioForge, and many more. Meanwhile, the 5th generation era of video game consoles had begun, with 32-bit machines like the 3DO, the Sega Saturn, and the new Sony PlayStation enshrining 3D graphics as the new standard for games. Orphagrams had already begun porting the Alone in the Dark series to these devices, but by this point the original games had lost their novelty value and were looking a little stale in comparison to newer 3D titles, resulting in weaker reviews and dwindling sales figures. Taking all these factors into consideration, it must have seemed to Orphagrams that they'd squeezed pretty much all the blood they could get out of this stone. Rather than continue with Alone in the Dark 4, Orphagrams put the development team to work on an entirely new series, which was to be branded as the Timegate Adventures. Just as that trusty oil lamp came to symbolise the Alone in the Dark brand, the Timegate series would adopt a stylised Templar's seal as its emblem. According to the scenario writers, this icon was chosen due to its likeness to a clock or sundial, representing both the cycle of history and the inexorable countdown to the end of all mortal life. The general idea behind the series was that each game would involve travelling into the past and becoming enmeshed in some sort of grand decimillennial conspiracy. The first chapter of this new series, Secret of the Templars, would take place in medieval France, whilst future episodes would send the hero to other exciting historical eras, such as ancient Egypt and World War II. The development team were mostly veterans of Alone in the Dark 2 and 3, with a few left over from the original game or having joined Orphagrams in 1994 to work on the point-and-click adventure Prisoner of Ice. The venerable old Alone in the Dark engine was given a number of long overdue upgrades, with much more detailed 3D mapped models, Goro shading, smoother animations, as well as more intelligent and aggressive AI opponents. The developers had reportedly wanted to work on a game set in the Middle Ages for some time, though Orphagrams had concerns about the marketability of a game revolving around a medieval abbey. Like many European publishers, Orphagrams salivated at the thought of breaking into the North American market, and directed the team to make the game more appealing to overseas audiences. It was mandated, for example, that the game's protagonist be an American rather than a Frenchman, as there was a widespread perception that a game being too overtly European would limit its appeal in the US. Similarly, the historical Knights Templar were not, at the time, considered that big a draw for audiences outside of France, and the game's title was changed to Knight's Chase in English-speaking markets. But even after this push to give the project a more contemporary cross-Atlantic appeal, Timegate was still dripping with medieval aesthetics. Some members of the team had an education in medieval history, and one was involved in the HEMA sword-fighting scene. Artists and writers visited several historically important locations to help inspire the look and themes of the first episode, with a couple of previews suggesting there would be a sort of pseudo-educational element to the Timegate series. But in terms of game mechanics, Timegate would be almost identical to Alone in the Dark, and most early coverage of the game made no attempt to hide these similarities. The perception that Timegate was a spiritual successor to Alone in the Dark was something of a double-edged sword for Orphagrams. The game was marketed as being made by the developers of Alone in the Dark. The brand itself still carried positive connotations after all, but Orphagrams were clearly worried that criticisms of Alone in the Dark 3 and general audience fatigue with the series would be carried over to the new Timegate franchise. In an interview with PC Gamer, producer Hubert Chardot took an almost apologetic tone, sheepishly admitting that the first episode would feature the exact same problems that had plagued previous games, such as awkward controls and issues with the fixed camera system. Arthurgrams tried to preempt further criticism by insisting that Episode 1 of Timegate was meant to be, in their words, a bridge between the original Alone in the Dark trilogy and a more ambitious second episode, promising that after Knight's Chase, the series would be able to switch to a fully 3D engine and shed the limitations of past titles. All players needed to do was be patient. But when Timegate was released for MS-DOS and Windows in December 1995, it was clear that the Alone in the Dark formula had already exhausted the patience of many reviewers. Knight's Chase received mixed reviews from critics. On the positive side, many reviewers noted that the overall visuals were a step up from Alone in the Dark 3, particularly the smoother and more realistic character models. The game's puzzles were also lauded as providing a decent challenge for the average player, and the overall atmosphere and attention to authenticity were given high marks for immersing players in Timegate's medieval environments. But the bulk of reviews leaned more towards the negative. A lot of criticism was levelled at the game for being overly linear and punishing players for exploration or experimentation, and a few reviewers thought some of the puzzles were too obtuse. The control scheme also caught flack for being awkward and outdated, and some thought the game's plot overcomplicated and confusing. But the most consistent criticism, repeated even in the more positive reviews, was that players had seen all this before. Most reviews observed that playing Timegate felt like playing Alone in the Dark all over again, and that anyone hoping for a fresh or innovative experience would be better off looking elsewhere. In the UK, for example, PC Zone pointed out that Arthurgrams were selling Timegate for the exact same price as an Alone in the Dark trilogy pack, and that for new players, the latter deal seemed far better value for money. An updated version of Timegate was released for the North American market in 1996, but in the end, Timegate was not a major financial success for Arthurgrams. Though not a disaster, it simply wasn't successful enough to warrant further investment. Instead of revitalizing the Alone in the Dark formula, Timegate itself ended up being cancelled, with the development team moved to unrelated projects or leaving Arthurgrams entirely. Alone in the Dark did eventually get its second chance at life, rebooted in 2001 as The New Nightmare, and it seems like there are attempts at resurrecting the series every half a decade or so, but the Timegate franchise, its intended successor, remains in the past. The game did garner some fans in Europe, and retrospective videos pop up now and again on YouTube. In fact, speedrunner Arnaud33200 recently organised interviews with former Arthurgrams staff regarding the game's history and cut content, portions of which he kindly took the time to transcribe for my benefit, and I will be referring back to those during this video. But the game is mostly forgotten in English-speaking countries. When it is mentioned, it's often mixed up with Adelin's Time Commando, which was released a few months later, or the much more popular Broken Sword series, with which it shared some of the same story beats. Despite its obscurity, the game found its way to Steam and GOG in 2018, giving everyone a second chance to join William Tibbs' adventures in time, and this is the version I'll be reviewing in today's video. We'll take a look at how the game plays, how closely it hews to the Alone in the Dark formula, and how other games tackled similar ideas. So without further ado, let's jump into the first and only episode of the Timegate adventures. Right off the bat, Timegate's gameplay will be familiar to Alone in the Dark fans. The game world is divided into individual scenes that are viewed from a fixed camera angle, much like any typical survival horror game. Our hero, William Tibbs, is controlled via keyboard in the usual tank control style, and by hitting the Enter key, players can choose from several different stances for Tibbs. For general gameplay, the two most important are the Open and Search stance, and the Push or Pull stance. The first is the standard method of interacting with the environment, directing Tibbs to nose through desks and shelves for useful items, read a document, or comment on a point of interest. The The second has fairly obvious implications, used for pressing switches, moving levers, or shoving objects around the room. Once the player has picked up an item, they'll be able to select that item and do something with it, like putting on clothing or swiping a security card to open a cabinet. A few items unlock further options, such as being able to throw a bottle or fire a catapult, but most of the time you're just using an item on yourself or on another object in the environment. There are also a couple of occasions in which the game will force you into a context-specific stance, like when Tibbs enters a room of security lasers and drops to the floor so he can crawl under the beams more easily. The last stance available to Tibbs is for fighting. By entering this mode and holding down the spacebar, Tibbs can use the arrow keys to swing his weapon from several different directions. Different weapons have varying range or attack speed depending on the direction key you hold down whilst swinging. Tibbs can also enter a parry stance to block enemy attacks. At first, combat mode is pretty useless since you'll only be running into tourists or museum staff, but once the player starts encountering enemies, they'll need to work out which attack types best fit the different enemy types. Some enemies have pretty slow and long range swings, whilst others will charge right up to Tibbs and start flailing away. Players can adjust the difficulty level in the main menu to change the pace of combat. At the highest level, combat is much faster and attacks do more damage, whilst at the lowest level, players will have more time to figure out the controls. If the player takes damage, they'll need to restore their health by finding an item of food or drink, although Tibbs will also have his health reset if he finds a protective item or after certain scripted events. Story-wise, Tibbs is meant to be searching for his fiancée, but in practical terms, all this means is that the player is trying to progress from one room to the next, trying to bypass obstacles like locked doors or an invincible guard. The general layout of the environments is fairly linear. As a general rule, Tibbs will only have access to a handful of interconnected rooms at once, so it's unlikely the average player will get horribly lost at any point. Most of the time the player will be running between these rooms to grab items and bring them back to the corresponding puzzle. To swing across a chasm, for example, William needs to grab the rope hanging from a bell. To complete the puzzle, William needs something he can use to reach over to the rope and something to muffle the sound of the bell. But William can't even reach the bell until he finds a way through a roaring fire, and the items he needs are found behind a locked door and protected by a rather surly ram, so William will need to work out how to deal with these obstacles first. Overall, the puzzles aren't especially difficult, as whilst a few can leave you scratching your head, the solutions are confined to a pretty small area and can be brute forced with enough pushing and prodding of various points of interest. But the player will have to stay on their toes during certain sequences, as whilst regular enemies aren't too troublesome, there are a few points in the game where the player is under a time limit. In these sections, Tibbs will need to evade or overcome a tougher foe, either by running past them or solving a puzzle before they arrive. These latter challenges tend to be much more unforgiving, as failure will result in an immediate game over rather than just taking a bit of damage. Timegate thus rewards those with a sharp intellect, good reaction speed, and cool under pressure, whilst players who fail any of these three requirements will find themselves banished to the depths of time. I'm not entirely sure what Infogrames were going for with Timegate's gameplay. That the game is, functionally speaking, just Alone in the Dark 4 is something I don't think anyone can dispute. The controls are the same, the combat mechanics are the same, the different stances and the way you use items is the same, and a good number of the puzzle solutions are actually identical to those of the first three games. And yet, it doesn't feel like this is meant to be an Alone in the Dark game. The impression I get from Timegate is that, on the one hand, it was trying to move away from the survival horror side of Alone in the Dark, and be a bit more accessible, sort of like a traditional point-and-click adventure with an emphasis on puzzle solving and storytelling. On the other hand, I think Infogrames wanted the game to feel like a blockbuster action-adventure movie, with cinematic moments like heroic duels and death-defying stunts. I don't think these two approaches meshed too well in the end, as the puzzle-solving side is alright, but the action-adventure elements don't work quite so well. The combat isn't too bad in itself. It can be annoying to get stun-locked by certain enemies, especially when it seems like your attacks aren't connecting, but the same thing can happen to the enemy, and you can always reload your save from wherever you like, so it's not something you're going to smash your keyboard over. But it still feels a lot less involving than the combat in more traditional survival horror games, which is kind of odd since it is technically slightly more sophisticated than Alone in the Dark or Resident Evil's combat. The different attack types and parry systems should, in theory, make the combat more interesting than rival titles, especially since there are several different weapon types with their own unique properties. It doesn't really work out this way in the game though, as most of the time you only have access to your fists and one or two other weapons, one of which is always far superior to the alternative options. There's no reason to use your hands when you have a giant axe, for example. Well, unless you're speedrunning. There's one point where you can wield a religious icon against specific enemies, but it's a very brief diversion from mindless hacking and slashing. Maybe people felt differently back in the day, but I think nowadays players are a bit more forgiving of combat in survival horror games, as it's just sort of accepted that some of the tension comes from both the clunky controls and the resource management element. Flailing away with a sword in Timegate feels, at best, comical, and it just doesn't have the same feeling as desperately pumping bullets into lumbering zombies. Timegate's combat being more forgiving than, say, Alone in the Dark's actually works against it, as there was a real sense of panic in running out of bullets or seeing your escape routes cut off in the first game, something that's just not present in Timegate. In Timegate, most enemies are just distractions, and their supposedly improved AI isn't really relevant since it's unlikely to come into play in the first place. You don't get trapped or chased by enemies because most players will just kill them as soon as they appear. This imposing looking fellow was a big part of the game's marketing, but it's hard to take him seriously when the game's tutorial level lets you shank him with a screwdriver. The biggest threat to the player's health is not black knights or demonic beasts, but these scripted fail states that are all over the place in Timegate. Even in the tutorial level, you can so easily walk into the wrong room and get a sudden game over, even though, ironically, the end of the tutorial actually forces you to fail in order to progress. Flicking through some of the reviews of the day, almost everyone commented on this issue. The most common complaint was that there are numerous sections in the Abbey where you can wander into a random room and, without warning, immediately get shot and killed by a crossbowman. In some cases, you don't even need to be in the same room as the guard. This is especially stupid since you fight crossbow-wielding guards as conventional enemies in other parts of the game. This sort of thing definitely impacted the game's review scores and detracted from the attempt to make the game more accessible. I'm tempted to chalk this up to a lack of third-party playtesting, but there's a good chance this is all by design. Killing the player off for no good reason is a trope that has existed since the first Alone in the Dark. In an interview with Edge magazine, the game's director, Frédéric Renal, said, "A game is 80% movement. This is where you want the player to be scared when doing these simple things. In Alone in the Dark, when he opens his first door, there's a monster right behind it and he immediately dies. When he walks down his first corridor, the floorboards collapse and he kills himself. From that moment, he will be scared all the time." I'm not entirely sure I agree with this philosophy. I think it's more annoying than anything else. But again, if there were one genre where this approach could work, it would be survival horror, reminding players that the universe doesn't care a whit for your existence and death is always but a footstep away. In Timegate, you don't have that defense, though. You're not supposed to feel scared or on edge all the time, so all it does is get on your nerves and make you think the game is being a dick for no reason. It's kind of like playing one of those Dragon's Lair style games, where a lot of work went into coming up with increasingly ridiculous ways to kill the player off, and getting all the different game over scenes was, in a weird sort of way, itself part of the experience. Really, the only parts of Timegate I found genuinely exciting were the extremely brief sections where it still felt like a survival horror, where William had to evade an enemy instead of just bopping them on the head a few times. As you can probably tell, I do personally feel very strongly that Timegate would have worked better as that sort of game. Funnily enough, previous iterations did lay the groundwork for mechanics that I think would have worked well in a survival horror-esque version of Timegate. I liked how in Alone in the Dark 3 you had enemies who could only be killed using specific items or weapons, so rather than just mow down everything in your path, you had to evade certain foes until you found the appropriate tool. This was used in a very rudimentary way at the time, with these mini-boss enemies usually just acting like glorified barricades, but I thought 2005's Haunting Ground pulled this off quite well, having each chapter revolve around the player being hunted by a unique boss creature who couldn't be defeated until the climax of that chapter. It would have been interesting if, in Timegate, characters like the Black Knight or the Executioner served a similar role, relentlessly hunting William through the halls of the Abbey until he acquired the means to dispatch them for good. But that's all a pipe dream, obviously. Onfogrames didn't want another survival horror, and I suspect the development team, some of whom had been making Alone in the Dark games since the early 90s, were probably tired of horror at that point. Frédéric Raynal, who founded Adolin after leaving Onfogrames in 1993, said the team at Adolin made the more light-hearted Little Big adventure as a counter to the shift towards darker games that began with Alone in the Dark and was accelerated by the release of violent shooters like Doom. So the team behind Alone in the Dark 2 and 3 wanting to take a break from that sort of experience is understandable. But if we leave all that behind, how well does Timegate work as an adventure game? Better than it did as an action game, in my opinion. The puzzles are fairly well balanced for a casual audience, a bit more thought-provoking than the stuff we get today, but not as difficult as some of the nastier Sierra games. The team certainly had experience with more involving challenges, as Shadow of the Comet and Prisoner of Ice illustrate, so there was definitely a conscious effort at not making things too unpleasant for players. Sure, there are some counterintuitive solutions, and I'm ashamed to admit I did have to check a guide for the tutorial of all places, but as long as players remember to make use of a few different save slots, they shouldn't end up in an unwinnable situation. If there's something I really would have liked to see more of, it's puzzles that actually made use of the setting and time period. There's a puzzle where you have to learn to mix ink, for example, and another where you craft a sleeping draft. Unfortunately, all you do in these sequences is look at a book and then activate all the items in front of the appropriate environmental trigger. I would have loved to have something with a bit more player engagement, like how Kingdom Come Deliverance had a whole mini-game based around learning to read Latin. It would have been nice to have more puzzles based around monastic life or the tenets of the knightly orders, and more importantly, that players had a bit more freedom to apply some critical thinking to these puzzles. Timegate could have been something really unique if it had opened up its environments a bit more to let players explore more freely, observe daily life in the Abbey, and talk to NPCs. Based on a bit of investigation by Arnaud 33200, it seems like there were some things that were cut from Timegate, possibly including alternate routes to puzzles or perhaps larger environments. I saw a recent review of the game that mentioned In the Name of the Rose, a historical murder mystery novel also set in a 14th century religious retreat. I'll come back to this point later in the video, but from a gameplay standpoint, it's just interesting to imagine what Timegate could have been if it was structured more like a traditional adventure game, with the focus on dialogue, puzzles, and investigative work instead of wonky combat and instant death cinematic sequences. If I can't have a survival horror game, I'd still be happy with a pleasant point-and-click adventure. But it is what it is. This is the game Onfogrames made, and we can take it or leave it. I think Timegate's problem is that it didn't go far enough to distinguish itself from the Alone in the Dark series, yet at the same time it did go far enough that the problems it shares with earlier titles can no longer be excused as a byproduct of survival horror mechanics. If you've never tried the Alone in the Dark series, I think the first game is a much better display of the team's talents than Timegate. To sum it up, Timegate is 50% passable adventure game and 50% clunky substandard action game. So if you really like the former and you're not too put off by the latter, then I think you might still enjoy Timegate. Having worked on the broody and macabre Alone in the Dark trilogy for more than 3 years straight, it must have been a relief for the Timegate team to finally get a chance to do something different. say goodbye to creaking manors, ghastly boudoirs, and dilapidated ghost towns, and say hello to 14th century France. The developers spent some time visiting museums and various historical sites to help them establish the game's visual direction, in particular the Musée de Cluny in Paris. This building had an especially strong influence on the game's look, as not only did the site house an extensive collection of art and icons from the Middle Ages, but was itself originally built in the 14th century by the abbots of the Cluny monastery. Timegate has a wonderfully overwrought medieval aesthetic, plastering the main menu with Templar iconography and various other parts of the interface with their own period-appropriate visuals. It's nice to see that Timegate avoided the Hollywood cliché of having the Middle Ages be all doom and gloom, with hunchbacked peasants and mud-stained sackcloth. In this early demo build of the game, the inventory screen is very cold and stereotypically gothic, with a generic health bar flanked by two leering stone gargoyles. By the time of the game's full release, this had evolved into a much more colourful stained glass interface that better evokes the power, wealth, and artistic patronage of medieval religious orders. Despite the entire game being set in a single location, I never found Timegate's environments dull or repetitive. No medieval game would be complete without dank prison cells and a torture chamber, of course, but there are also libraries, hearthfires, secret hideaways, and beautiful chapels to explore. I actually started to feel quite peckish whilst wandering around the Abbey larders, and some of the exterior locations have a very relaxing feel to them, with snowflakes gently drifting to the soft, white earth. As was typical of fixed camera games, most of Timegate's environments are pre-rendered, with 3D models for the characters, items, and some of the interactive objects. Although the backgrounds are done in a very painterly style, the game's low resolution means that everything blends together pretty well in-game. I especially like little touches like creepy crawlies scuttling into the shadows. This wasn't the first time the Alone in the Dark series had done something like this, so it wasn't anything revolutionary, but Timegate does do a really good job of making effects seem like they're part of both the 2D and 3D world, like here when you get demonic faces manifesting in the walls. Based on the credits, it seems like Timegate had a pretty large art and graphics department for the time. I imagine this is because some of the artists specialised in the background art, some the 3D models, other the cutscenes, and so on. Back at release, several reviewers were impressed by the game's seamless transition from gameplay to FMV mini-movies and back. These don't look so remarkable today, but do give you an extra sense of accomplishment for finishing some of the more difficult puzzles. A bit more unique are the illustrated cutscenes that explain the history of the Knights Templar. Alone in the Dark 2 did something similar with its flashbacks to the history of One-Eyed Jack and his crew, although I don't think the artists are the same. The Timegate illustrations are a little too obviously comic book-esque compared to the authentic tapestries used for some of the background art, but they're a good display of the artist's talents. On a more technical level, the Timegate engine is similar enough to Alone in the Darks that some of the same tools developed for those games are at least partly compatible with Timegate. Tigruin's Alone in the Dark Room Viewer, for example, has been used to see parts of Timegate that were not meant for mortal eyes. According to Arnaud, there are a lot of quirks to the original Alone in the Dark engine that can also be exploited in Timegate, like the way item pickups or death states work. Amphigram's really got their money's worth out of that old engine. That said, the team did get the opportunity to make some technological improvements on Timegate. The most notable feature that Amphigram's played up in the marketing was the addition of Gouraud shading, which, according to a Wikipedia entry I spent 30 seconds on, allowed for improved real-time lighting effects on the character models. According to previews of the game, innovations like this were thanks to the staff making use of new 3D mapping software, which apparently helped the artists and animators collaborate more closely on the final look of the characters. I won't pretend to understand the technical side of this stuff, but the end result was that the models were certainly more detailed than those of previous games in the series. Whilst they look quite silly today, especially during cutscenes, they are noticeably more human-like in their dimensions than the models in Alone in the Dark 3, and the animations are much smoother. As one reviewer put it, they no longer look like they were made out of cardboard boxes. But even by the standards of the time, these models weren't exactly groundbreaking, and later reviews of the game, from summer 1996 onwards, referred to them as blocky or embarrassing. I have to say that some contemporary reviewers were unreasonably critical of Timegate's graphics. PC Gamer, for example, said that whilst the hand-drawn backgrounds looked very nice, they were dated in comparison to Delphin Software's Fade to Black, which was released a few months prior to Timegate. This seems like a really bizarre criticism today, seeing how Spartan and simplistic the 3D environments looked in Delphin's game, but it's a reminder of just how overwhelming the push for 3D graphics was in the mid-90s. Today we can look back at stuff like hand-drawn 2D art, fixed camera placement and so on, and appreciate their advantages, but it's important to remember that back in the day, most in the industry saw this sort of thing as a consolation prize in place of so-called true 3D graphics. Even the original Alone in the Dark, which was regarded as revolutionary in 1992, was seen by its creators as a stepping stone to fully 3D environments. Similarly, it's been stated several times by Capcom staff that a major reason for Resident Evil's use of fixed cameras was due to concern that the PlayStation's hardware would not be able to handle a true 3D world. Moving into 1996 and beyond, it was extremely difficult for developers to resist the switch to 3D. So whilst it's interesting to imagine what Timegate 2 would have looked like, we're probably quite lucky we got another chance to see Amphigram's talented 2D artists strut their stuff. In terms of sound design, Timegate got a pretty good reception from critics. The sound effects are very sharp and clear, without too much of the noticeable audio distortion that plagued a lot of games of this era. Even in the middle of a fight, you can always make out who's attacking and when your hits are connecting, which they often don't in spite of visual evidence. Several reviews remarked on the game's use of ambient sound to set the mood, and the spooky atmosphere in some of the lonelier environments, where the wind whispers through cracks in the stonework and Tibb's own footfalls are ominously loud. In keeping with its cinematic pretensions, most of Timegate's dialogue is voice acted, and Tibbs or another character will often narrate cutscenes or documents. Reviews of the day weren't especially impressed with the quality of the acting, and to some extent that's a fair point. Is this guy Scottish or Russian, for example?
I, Wolfram, Deputy to the Grand Inquisitor of Paris.
But I think a fair bit of the blame should be placed at the feet of the localization. Some of the lines appear to have been translated very literally and sound absurd when spoken out loud. Were I one of the voice actors, I would have no idea how to deliver a line like this.
Do you wish to find your fiancée Juliet, who's been missing for several days? Then come and seek her in the dark recesses of the secret jails of the Museum of Medieval History.
A couple of people have told me that the English language version of Timegate actually has dialogue that's missing in the other versions, though I'm not entirely sure why that would be. It may be related to confusion over the 1995 and 1996 releases of Timegate, which I'll come back to in a minute. Reviewers weren't quite so keen on Timegate's soundtrack as they were its general sound design, one describing it merely as repetitive. The Alone in the Dark franchise had a rather high turnover for composers, and each soundtrack in the series was always done by someone different. Timegate's music was handled by Pascal Camizotto, who says that it was actually his first job in the industry. The opening theme is really good, but I can see why reviewers were less impressed by the in-game music. By the mid-90s, reviewers were just starting to become accustomed to Hollywood-style soundtracks, especially in titles that marketed themselves as cinematic experiences. But Timegate's music is more a product of the earlier half of the decade, when MIDI format was the standard. Some of the tracks do a very nice job of imitating the medieval pipe organ that we associate with the period, but others sound very generic and could have been lifted from pretty much any game of the era. It's a shame the soundtrack isn't packaged as an extra on the GOG release, but I doubt most people would care to listen to it outside the game. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's actually more than one version of Timegate floating around. From what I can gather, the original UK and European release of Timegate, shipped in December 1995 or a few months later depending on the country, is the version most people played back in the day and is the basis for the digital release that's currently sold on GOG and Steam. However, another version of Timegate was released later in 1996, possibly exclusive to the North American market, though I'm not entirely clear on that point. This version included support for SVGA mode, running at a higher resolution than the original game and using remastered assets, including retouched background and interface art, and in some cases completely new assets. But this updated release seems to involve more extensive changes to the game than just a visual upgrade. For one, some of the on-voice dialogue has been changed, possibly to better match American English expressions. There are also cases of dialogue being removed entirely, like with the Japanese TV crew in the tutorial, who jabber incoherently at Tibbs in the original release, but are silent in the USA version. In some cases, extra text and graphics have been added that reveal more details about the plot. The control scheme itself is slightly different, and it appears very small changes have been made to some of the puzzles and scripts. I only played an hour or so of this version, but the intrepid Arnaud says that there seem to be several other small adjustments, changing how some of the basic mechanics of the game operate under the hood. Summing it all up, what I think happened is that the North American release, which was especially important to Onfogrames, was delayed to incorporate some of the feedback from early reviews, sort of a half-patch, half-extra special localization treatment for US audiences. I could very well be mistaken on some of these points, so chime in the comments if you know differently, but I couldn't find any box art or marketing material outside of America that advertised the SVGA mode, so I assume it was part of the 1996 USA package. The GOG release mentions SVGA mode, but doesn't actually seem to include any of the relevant files, and based on the in-game content is the original 1995 release. The obvious question that someone on the GOG forums asked is why this upgraded version wasn't included. One answer could be licensing issues. It's possible the USA version was released under a different publishing agreement, as there was a very confusing legal arrangement between Onfogrames and Interplay at that time. Another possible reason is that this version is not regarded as objectively superior to the 1995 one. First of all, the game's FMV cutscenes play in a tiny window instead of full screen. Second, and maybe this is just me, the higher resolution assets actually make the game look worse. The backgrounds and interface look kind of like they were ham-fistedly upscaled rather than properly redrawn, and the 3D models no longer blend in so well with the environmental art. You can have a look at footage from other channels and decide for yourself, of course, but the fact of the matter is that, at least at the time of making this video, the special 1996 release is only legally available in physical form. In my opinion, the GOG release is perfectly fine, so unless you're a collector or something of the like, stick with that version if you're interested in the game. Timegate opens with a duel between the Templar Galra and a warrior clad in midnight armour. Galra is dealt a mortal blow, and the Black Knight reveals that Wolfram, the fox with the red mane, has kidnapped one Juliette Provence. The knight sneers that Juliette's fiancé William will come to her rescue, only to be caught in an inescapable trap in which he will finally lose his eternal life. Despite his wound, Galra evades the coup de grace and defeats the Black Knight, swearing that he will not die until the day William arrives and retrieves the glove that will open the gates of time. In modern-day Paris, William Tibbs, an unassuming American law student, frets over the disappearance of his fiancée Juliette. Tibbs is attacked by a mysterious knight, but handily defeats his assailant with his own weapon, and the knight leaves behind a ring and an enchanted mirror. Peering into the mirror, Tibbs sees a vision of Juliette bound to a stake, and is taunted by an unseen enemy, visible only as two glowing red eyes. This foe addresses William as the Falcon of Light, and tells him Juliette has been imprisoned somewhere within the nearby Museum of Medieval History. Tibbs heads to the museum and begins his search, where a friendly voice guides him to an exhibit depicting the Templar commander Thibaut de Montdidier. Soon afterwards, Wolfram appears, locking Tibbs in the museum and again setting the Black Knight upon him. Tibbs defeats the knight once, twice, and thrice more, and resumes the search for Juliette, but is ambushed by Wolfram's thugs and thrown down the museum well. The voice of Tibbs' ally returns, giving him cryptic advice about retrieving the 7 stones of the 7 brothers and reuniting the twin ancestors of mankind. Tibbs awakens in 14th century France, where he is promptly arrested by Wolfram and his men. Wolfram reveals himself to be deputy to the Grand Inquisitor of Paris, and declares that Tibbs is in fact Thibaut de Montdidier, the last Templar. Wolfram sentences Tibbs to be burned at the stake for witchcraft, and throws him in jail beneath the Templars' former commandery, now an abbey controlled by Wolfram and the Inquisition. There, Tibbs befriends a mute, who helps him escape his cell. Tibbs begins to explore the abbey in search of Juliette, but witnesses Wolfram and his allies performing dark rituals that attract demons and foul spirits, whose evil begins to warp the abbey down to its very foundations. It seems that Wolfram himself is still searching for artifacts that the Templars hid around the abbey grounds before their dissolution, and somewhere deep within the abbey's depths hides the dying Templar Galra, who desperately clings to the conviction that Tibbs will arrive to claim the Glove of Time and defeat the darkness that threatens both mankind's past and its future. A common theme of contemporary reviews of Timegate was that whilst the setup, with time travel, Templars, medieval conspiracies, reincarnation, ancient powers and so on, was all very imaginative, the execution of these ideas was an absolute mess. One problem is that the game dumps quite a bit of exposition in the first 20 minutes of playtime, when the player is still getting their bearings and probably not paying too close attention. I read a PC Gamer retrospective of Timegate that suggested the connection between Tibbs and Thibaut de Montdidier should have been teased out over time, rather than revealed 5 minutes after the intro movie. It's a legitimate point, as it seems like the kind of plot point you'd use as a sort of mid-game twist. I'm guessing Onfogrames were worried about players getting annoyed and quitting the game too early if they didn't understand what was going on or why they were somehow transported back to the 14th century. It's clear from the later 1996 release that Onfogrames didn't feel they'd gone far enough in explaining Timegate's story, as that version has some additional in-game documentation that tries to clarify some of the wackier elements. Looking back at the game after finishing it, this also explains some of the quirks of the game's voice dialogue, like why Wolfram is often awkwardly referred to as Wolfram, the fox with the red mane, or Wolfram, deputy to the Grand Inquisitor of Paris. It seems like the writers wanted to leave clues for the player to pick up on themselves, but were also terrified players wouldn't understand what the hell was going on. So the game hits the player with both exposition dumps and dialogue that sounds more like a riddle than something a real person would ever say. And even after going through the manual, rewatching the cutscenes, and glancing at the extra material added by the 1996 release, I'm still very confused by the events of Timegate. The game is really inconsistent on the subject of how time travel and immortality actually work. Sometimes a character is stated to be a descendant of another character, sometimes a reincarnation of that character, and sometimes literally that very same character all along. Some characters are clearly one or the other, some seem to be all three depending on the line, and it's implied that some characters are being disguised as or possessed by other characters, making things 10 times as confusing. Tibbs himself is stated to be the medieval Templar Thibaut de Montdidier, and also seems to have lived through the American Civil War and World War II, presumably losing his memories or dying and being reincarnated at various points. However, it's also implied Tibbs is actually the manifestation of an ancient power, or maybe Thibaut was always that same ancient power. I don't really know. But that ancient power is also implied to be reincarnated in a completely different character. This seems to happen with Wolfram as well, and I'm still not sure what Juliet's role was meant to be. She seems to be nothing more than bait for William, although in that case I'm not sure whether Juliet physically travelled back to the 14th century, whether that Juliet was actually an ancestor of Juliet, or what. Wolfram seems intent on using Juliet in some sort of ritual, and considering the specific mythological figures represented by Tibbs and Wolfram, I wonder if Juliet herself was more than she appeared to be. It's especially difficult to interpret this fantastical side of the plot due to the writers apparently being unsure of which myths they're actually drawing from. For most of the game, the supernatural elements have strong Christian and European overtones, with Satanism, black magic, biblical devils, and so on, but later on it becomes clear that these exist alongside creatures from Egyptian mythology. The cosmology of the Timegate universe is very confusing. Several retrospective reviews noted that the Assassin's Creed franchise shared some suspicious similarities with Timegate's story. Whilst these similarities are a bit exaggerated, it's a useful comparison to make, as the Assassin's Creed franchise had similar problems trying to combine elements from the myths and legends of multiple real-world cultures into a single coherent setting. Based on the interviews Arnaud did with former Infogrames staff, it seems like the writers often just put stuff in because it sounded cool, assuming they could make sense of it when they got round to making Timegate Chapter 2. Had the Timegate franchise continued, I'm sure it would have taken a similar route to the Assassin's Creed games with regards to its background lore. But let's leave behind the wilder elements of Timegate's story and come back to the medieval side. It might seem strange to hear that Infogrames considered the Knights Templar too obscure a subject to be the focus of a historical adventure. Assuming the game began pre-production around 1994, Infogrames must have been aware that the Templars had popped up in media as recently as the late 80s and early 90s, and I'm sure the marketing department believed most Western audiences were at least vaguely aware of the name. Still, I suppose looking at it in context, the mid-90s wasn't the height of Templar mania. It was just after Timegate came out that there was a sudden onslaught of Templar-related games. Azrael's Tear featured them in 1996, the Gabriel Knight series got in on the action in 1999, Deus Ex of course took advantage of conspiracy theories surrounding the Order, even the Tomb Raider series made a brief foray into the subject matter, and the list kept growing well into the 2000s. Infogrames must have been absolutely livid when the Da Vinci Code was published in 2003. Had that franchise kicked off a decade earlier, Timegate probably would have been able to capitalize on a sudden frenzy of interest in all things Templar related. In the gaming world, though, the obvious comparison is the Broken Sword series. Shadow of the Templars was released just 6 months after Timegate, and in terms of storytelling it had a massive advantage over Infogrames' game. That advantage being that it was a point-and-click adventure. I mentioned earlier how Timegate might have worked better as a traditional adventure game, and I don't want to belabor that point. I just think it's interesting to compare the writing in both games. Broken Sword features wonderfully memorable characters. Even some of the throwaway NPCs have a depth and charm that's missing from those in Timegate. It also does a much better job explaining the Templar conspiracy and establishing the player's immediate motivation from scene to scene. And keep in mind, Broken Sword is divided into not only different screens, but completely different locations, from a villa in Spain to a church in Scotland. The fact Broken Sword manages to keep the writing tight and intimate despite these changes in locale makes Timegate, which takes place entirely in one location, look a little red-faced. That brings us back round to thinking of In the Name of the Rose, because it's such a shame Timegate didn't let us interact with the monks and servants at the Abbey. Adding at least 2 or 3 repeating NPCs we could talk to throughout the game would really help bring the Abbey to life. Maybe having William take advantage of the Abbey's internal politics to gain access to new areas, distract guards, acquire items and all that, whilst learning more about what was happening with Wolfram and the Inquisition. Unfortunately, Onfogrames were hopelessly in love with this vision of a cinematic action-adventure, and we ended up with an almost incoherent narrative driven by a tiny cast of utterly forgettable characters. It's really sad because looking at the individual credits of the scenario writers, they were clearly capable of better. One of the benefits of writing for survival horror is that less is more, so it's easier to forgive plot holes and inconsistencies in a game like Alone in the Dark, when they don't draw attention to themselves. I think that the average player would process Timegate more in the way they would a traditional narrative, so it becomes harder to ignore its shortcomings. If you're interested in the Knights Templar, you'll likely get something out of Timegate's numerous little references to the Order's history and beliefs. But even then, there are more worthwhile games covering similar material, either in much greater detail or just with more skill. So my recommendation is you first check out some of the adventure games I mentioned earlier. After you've done that, then it might be worth considering Timegate. Taking the long view, I think Timegate was really just a victim of chickens coming home to roost. Almost all the things reviewers criticised it for in 1995 were criticisms that could be applied to earlier games in the series. If there'd been a bigger backlash to the cynical cash grab that was Alone in the Dark 2, Onfogrames might have decided that they weren't going to get away with milking the franchise as quickly and cheaply as possible. But they did, and in the process were slowly generating antipathy towards the brand, poisoning audience perceptions of the Alone in the Dark franchise and its successor for being too similar. There are two sides to blame for this, of course, one being consumers and the gaming press for encouraging it and continuing to pay full price for the same engine and mechanics released multiple times in a row. The other guilty party being Onfogrames' management, who wanted the Timegate franchise to be as successful as Alone in the Dark, but were too cheap to actually invest the necessary time and development costs into it. Based on previews and marketing, Onfogrames were obviously aware that they couldn't sell Timegate on gameplay innovations, and banked on the title being carried by improvements in the visuals. But the publisher underestimated how fast technology was moving in the 90s, and when the game made it to release, it really had very little to sell itself on beyond an already tarnished brand name. Onfogrames had promised that Timegate Episode 2 would be much more innovative, and based on our nose interviews, it does seem to be the case that certain members of the development team were planning to make the jump to a new 3D engine. But that game, and that engine, never materialized. The team as a collective whole would never again work on anything particularly ambitious, though individually many would scatter to other French development houses and work on titles like 2000's The Devil Inside and 2001's From Dusk Till Dawn. Other developers experimented with the puzzle-driven action-adventure, but this type of game was inevitably either pulled back into the realm of point-and-click adventures, or drawn towards the more lucrative third-person action genre. If a developer were handed the script for Timegate today, I suspect they'd try and make something more like 2019's story-driven action-adventure A Plague Tale. Looking at its place in the Alone in the Dark series, Timegate is an anomaly. A spiritual successor that's not. It's Alone in the Dark trying its best to not be Alone in the Dark. I suppose you could view 2002's Eternal Darkness on the Nintendo GameCube as a sort of alternative successor to the Alone in the Dark games. It kept the Lovecraftian themes and a light dash of survival horror, but shared Timegate's use of time travel and emphasis on hand-to-hand combat. So consider having a gander if that sounds like it might appeal to you. I suppose this video hasn't exactly made Timegate out to be a must-play retro title, but I think the game's legacy supports my lack of enthusiasm. Many people ignored it at release, and those that did play it mostly moved on without recommending it to others. Still, I don't consider Timegate a total failure. Though it didn't meet Amphagram's expectations, it did fulfill the lesser goal of making an action-adventure out of an Alone in the Dark game. If you'd like to experience Alone in the Dark in a completely different setting with a more cinematic bent, then it's worth playing. The game usually hovers around $6 or $7 on GOG, which isn't too unreasonable, but I've seen it drop much lower, so you might want to add it to your wishlist and wait for the next sale. And if I've put you off the game entirely, well, I hope you at least found this retrospective interesting. I'm a bit tuckered out on adventure games for the moment, so the next retro review will be the Slovakian tactical fantasy wargame Spellcross. But that's all for today's video, folks, so take care of yourselves and try not to start World War III whilst I'm gone. See you next time.